Welcome back to the CTO Playbook, the podcast dedicated to helping CTOs excel. We pour millions into new technology. We hire great people and build strong cultures. Yet most digital transformations still fail. So what if the problem isn't the technology and it isn't the people? What if the missing ingredient is the thing that connects them both? The process itself. In this episode of the CTO Playbook, I'm joined by Michael Louis Schank, author of the book Digital Transformation Success, to explore how his process inventory framework helps leaders turn complexity into clarity and create transformations that last. I'm your host, Adam Horner, coach to CTOs from startups to enterprises, helping you lead with clarity, confidence, and strategic impact. If you've ever thought that there must be an easier path than figuring it out the hard way, you're not alone. That's why I created the CTO Playbook, part of the platform I've built for tech leaders like you. Discover coaching, cohorts, and community at thectoplaybook.com. Your path, your pace, your playbook. Michael, welcome to the CTO Playbook. It's absolutely great to have you here. We've been speaking for a couple of months, I know. And so for the listeners who might be new to your work, could you share a little bit how you came to specialize in helping large financial organizations actually succeed at transformation and what motivated you to write your book, which I think is called Digital Transformation Success?
That's right. Yeah. So first off, Adam, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure getting to know you. So my background, I spent almost my whole career in consulting. So started 13 years at Accenture, spent some time at Bank of America, 10 years at EY, some time at Citi, and I decided to break free and do my own thing from there. First started my career as a technologist. First project was Java C++ programmer. I was a solution architect. I led large system integration projects. So I was your typical technologist. I didn't know anything about what the business did, other than I was a banking customer, so right. I knew the basic concepts. But my purview was, is the code delivered on time? Is it defect free? Is production up and stable? Like that's all I really, your typical put the guy in a closet, shove the instructions out and I deliver my code, right? Or whatever. Then that was my full time at Accenture, my time at Bank of America. Then I left to go to EY, and EY at that time sold their technology practice a few years back. So there was no kind of deep technologists or technology work to do there. And one of my first projects was working at a bank, and it was end of year and they had some money just on the table and they said, hey, we want you to create a business capability model for our retail banking. And for me, we did this. So I interviewed some people of the business, created everything that they did in a model that went 3 levels deep. And some people look at that, they're like, oh, that's interesting. To me, it was like this deeply epiphany moment. Like, oh my God, you get to know everything in this one model of everything the bank does. Like my mind was going crazy with all the possibilities to get people aligned and all the chaos that and I'll talk more about that I've seen earlier in my career.
Because that's a sizable chunk of work to map out that much, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was a 8-week, 12-week project, so it wasn't super detailed, but it was good enough to give me a sense of what it could mean. So then I decided to brand myself as the business architecture guy at EY, and I started doing more projects. I did another project that was at a mortgage company in the US, and they were outsourcing part of their business. And I worked with a client there that taught me a lot, which is, business architecture is based on business capability model, which is the ability of an organization to do something. But the problem is that it's a very abstract concept and you can't really tie it to the real world. So what we did in this project, and this project was ongoing when I joined it, but we had a massive team on there doing requirements, but they weren't anchored to anything. They were just running around talking to the business, writing stuff down, but there was no sense of what is complete? What does good look like? And what we did is I came in with my team and interviewed the business and documented every single process that they did. Not only how the process worked, but just the name and the structure. And now we gave it to the requirements team. We said, you need to follow the structure. Like when we did that structure, it was ownership. So attached to every node of this taxonomy. And they went through and they said, okay, process owner, what's your requirements to the future state? They document it, get the sign off. We went from bright red to bright green like in a matter of weeks. So I just really said, wow, this is amazing. So then in one of the benefits of a consulting career is you get to do a lot of diverse things. I mean, I've helped develop strategies. I've run transformation programs. I've done risk and compliance work, operational excellence work, you name it. And I kept applying this framework of what if I captured every process that your organization did and use it as a common language to get alignment between all the diverse types of people in an organization, from the business analysts, technology, architects, data people, you name it. And it always worked. And so I kept developing a playbook, and I sold this when I was at EY. But I got to a point where I didn't think I could mature it anymore. So then I left and went to Citi, and I was head of process excellence for their U.S. Retail bank. And their context is in 2020, they got hit with a $400 million consent order. Basically, the regulators came in and said, your control environment's terrible, and you need to fix this ASAP. So they spun up this massive control transformation program. And what I was doing is I was meeting with leaders and different business units within the personal bank and inventorying every single process that they did. And I took their data from their GRC, their governance, risk, and compliance platform, and I would map the existing risks and controls to those processes, which was not anchored to anything so kind of detailed or vigorous. And when I did that, a lot of clarity came in. Like, oh, now I'm the owner for this as the process owner, or I've got a lot of orphan controls that just don't make sense, or they're missing, or there was a lot of cleanup that we did. So I did that for a couple of years, and I'm like, there's only so much I could do with this. And I really had a passion for, I need to get this on paper. I think people need to learn this method of just, putting it kind of blunt terms, is just doing the hard work and detailing out what you do as a business and then using that as your guide. So I left and I wrote the book, and it published in December of 26. And now I've been doing my own consulting. So I work with other organizations that have read the book or understand the concept or believe that they need help with this area. And I help them with a playbook for how to stand this up, how to have a team for maintenance, and then how to use it for their use cases within their organization, be it transformation, operational excellence, risk and compliance, IT architecture, you name it. Now my latest thing is, and I just funded or kicked off a project to build an MVP of an AI platform, which takes all this knowledge and digitizes it into a vector data set, where LLMs can do gain all your insights, do predictive analytics and real-time monitoring, generate things like project charters and requirements, SOPs, et cetera. So essentially it's going to help you build quite a bit of the boilerplate of what you've been doing so far on a sort of a custom basis each time. Yep.
Okay, cool. And so in terms of, so you mentioned there sort of 2 points at which you realized, or where somebody else realized, hey, we need to have a complete map of what's going on in our organization. But was there any sort of particular failure modes or patterns that you saw repeatedly in addition to those 2 that sort of made you realize that sort of the traditional way wasn't working or wasn't effective?
Yeah, I think everyone who works in this space has experienced one chaotic or just disastrous program. It's almost guaranteed. And I've experienced a number of them. One was a international bank that was doing a core banking replacement program. And if you could think about the kind of technology interfaces, the impact to the business, how massive that was. And they didn't really have any structure, and it was just chaos that you couldn't believe.
But chaos that must have worked for a number of years previously.
For day-to-day operations, it does.
Right.
But when you're trying to transform and you need to get everyone aligned on what is the scope and what is our design and requirements and how are we going to test this thing. And that's why I say I always, there's a ubiquitous stat in the industry that 70% of transformations fail. Well, that's a good stat, but the question is, what does failure mean? They eventually got it done, but I'm sure they blew past their budget and timeline, their initial budget and timeline. I kind of would think that's a failure because you had to go to the board for, I don't know, I can't remember what it cost, but $50, $100 million more to get this over the finish line. that kind of hurts.
Yeah, that's a significant chunk of change when you're trying to slim down operations. You're normally doing a transformation for a reason, and quite often that reason is saving money, ironically.
Saving money, being more competitive, being more efficient. Like there's a lot of reasons. But yeah, when you put out a lot of that CapEx, you've got to have a long runway of OpEx to make up for it.
Yeah. So the beginning point then is this desire to transform, or a need to transform the business processes and the ways of working. But in terms of the gaps then that existed between sort of technology leadership and the business transformation, what did you see there that really needed to be closed down? Was it just what you call that sort of the chaos and the unstructure? Or was there something more sort of tangible or specific that we can look at and say, okay, there's a pattern that we can look at for the future?
I think the root cause of failure is the chaos, and ultimately it's the complexity.
Right.
Organizations grow over time. They grow their technology stack, their processes, their people, everything. Not necessarily intentionally. You just, as you define new products or define new opportunities, you grow it. I think the key to success, I boil it down to two things. One is alignment, and that has been written about since the 70s. But if you really read the literature, it's very soft or intangible. Like, you need to communicate more. You need to set goals, and you need to talk to people. Like, all that's good, and I would never discount it, but it's not really tangible. Like, I can't trace it to, this is what I need you to do to support our larger strategy. So I think that's a key is getting tangible alignment. So you're connecting all the dots from our vision and mission to why are we doing this thing to what processes need to change. And then the second one is systems thinking, which is understanding that our organization is made up of thousands or whatever components. If you think about all the different teams and the technology and risks and third parties and everything, and understanding that as a cohesive whole, and the relationships between all of those things and how they support your organization's strategy. So if you could get those two things right, then that's the path to transformation success.
Excellent. And I think that's, as you say, it's probably something that's fairly logical when you think about it, but the fact that most people haven't actually sort of sat down and gone, okay, where's going to be the failure point in our next sort of transformation I need to do?
Yeah.
Having led so many of these programs, what I want to do, Michael, is just sort of scoot you back a little bit in time then and go back to some of those earlier experiences you had, sort of the complex, high stakes environments. What did those sort of early transformation efforts look like from the inside? And what were some of the sort of biggest hurdles you personally faced as you were trying to run through those?
Just a lack of, I think the root cause ultimately, and this kind of speaks to alignment, is if you think about internal to an organization, everyone comes from their own perspective. So the biggest thing, and I don't know if you've ever seen the famous tree swing cartoon.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen that? Right. This is what the customer asked for. This is what the product manager designed. This is what technology built. And they're all different pictures of a tree swing. And I think ultimately it boils down to is we all live in our own worlds. We all have our own perceptions, but there's no way to connect the dots. And for a business person trying to discuss what they want in the product, a technology person is inevitably going to hear something different, and they're going to build something different. So bridging that gap across people is incredibly important. And without a proper methodology to understand how all those perspectives connect and how you could solve the language problem, that's really important.
Yeah, because I think the way in which that famous cartoon comes about really is when, I often liken it to the telephone game where you've got all these people in a line, and one person at one end is given the original requirement, and each person whispers it to the next so that the other people can't hear it.
Yeah.
And then at the end, you sort of get somebody saying something that sounds significantly different to what the first person said.
Yeah.
And each person in between has a different version of it. And that's kind of the same thing as the tree swing example.
As I mentioned in my background, I lived that. I was a technologist, and all I thought about this. And if a business person said anything about their products or anything about what they did, I'm like, that's just completely Greek to me. But how do you connect those two people so when they do need to communicate, you're effective?
And a lot of the time the advice that I hear is, well, let's have some open forums, let's have, the senior leadership talking about these things. But I think your point there is that what the typical engineer hears can be quite different, or what they understand can be quite different from what the leader actually says. The words can be different, the language can be different and unfamiliar, even though they're working in the same organization. They can be, miles apart in terms of comprehension.
Oh, yeah. I have a friend who was working at a company and the leadership was like, we're going to be cloud first. That's one of our strategic pillars. And he's like, I don't know what that means. And I don't know what that means for me. And that's to me, that was like, yeah, that's the problem statement right there. Is maybe it doesn't mean anything for him. And maybe he's, just there to support whoever needs to do whatever. But I think it's important if a leader's going to say something like that as a strategy, that you could trace it to specific roles and responsibilities.
And as well as that kind of communication gap, were there any sort of surprising, or maybe they weren't that surprising, but sort of the human factors that get in the way, whether that's culture, ownership, ambiguity?
Oh, yeah. I was on the inside of some delivery teams, and from my perspective, things are just not going well. Like we don't really have a grasp of what we're trying to accomplish. We're not making progress towards the dates that people have set. But then you have leaders or project managers standing in front of leadership saying, everything's on track. We don't have any issues. Like, well, it's obviously not true, but everyone's looking to save face and push the problem more down the line for when it really becomes critical. Like, oh, we don't have what you're asking for.
Yeah, and in the sort of the scale of organization you're talking about, where there's hundreds, sometimes even thousands of people working on these projects, you just take that one example and multiply it by 100, and you end up with that's obviously chaotic.
Yeah. And leaders don't really have a handle on what practitioners are doing on the ground. I really believe that leaders only know probably 2 or 3 levels, maybe 4 levels in their chain down of what's going on. Other than that, things are filtered up. And the information that's filtered up is biased towards the narrative that the lower level people want to give. And it's important. And, like I love Elon Musk's leadership. I think it's different. Is that when there's a problem, he goes directly to the engineers or directly to the doers and helps them solve it. But I think that's atypical of most organizations' leadership.
Absolutely. I think most organizations are fairly adamant about going through the chain of command, about not crossing the streams between one department and the next. It takes a certain kind of leader who's happy to just sort of run across those lines and worry about the implications later on, if at all.
Yeah, I need to know the details. This is my company. And, if a rocket's not landing on its pad or whatever, like I need to know what the exact issue is so I can help solve it.
And I think for most organizations, it just comes down to, well, it's a rounding error in terms of the amount of money that's being thrown around, and that lack of ownership and accountability is not often something that we talk about, other than to say that it exists and it's there. Whereas when you've got an owner on the business, they feel, because I talk to startups all the time, and they often talk about this, there's nobody else in the business who treats it like their money.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the impetus to sort of go those levels down, or go across the lines to go and find out what is the actual problem, and is there something that I can do personally to help out with that?
Yeah. And there's a lot of, and I've already kind of alluded to it, but there's a lot of politics in organizations, obviously. So people are just looking to save face and not necessarily address the core of what the problem is, because it's more about building your network and building your persona within the leadership team.
Yeah, and the politics are, a lot of people in smaller organizations, where I think a lot of my listeners are, look at those kind of large organization politics and think, oh, it's bad, it's deliberate, but it isn't really deliberate, is it? It's just the kind of thing that just it happens when you have more than 100 people working in the same organization. You have different agendas, and that's fairly normal and natural. But the other thing that I've also seen myself working, and this is true working on small organization projects as well, is that these transformation projects take time. They aren't the kind of thing that are put together. You talked about like 8 to 12 weeks as a discovery part of the process. That's a quarter. Mm-hmm. And in that time, any organization changes and shifts, and the goalposts can move weekly, if not monthly. Where did you sort of see similar dynamics in your projects, where there is this sort of drift? And how do you look at that drift and the way that it might or might not wreck progress?
Well, it's my belief. I think you need to do some top-down mapping of the goals, like tangibly. So if you have a process inventory, and I can map what's my mission, what's my vision, what's my strategy, what are my values, what are my objectives, and tie those directly to initiatives. But then your initiative scope, at the end of the day, you're changing what you do as a business, whether it's internal operations, customer facing, you name it. Now, if you could tie the scope of those initiatives directly to the processes and the environment, now you're linking it to a process owner and a process. And if you understand the process, and it's a big thing that I talk about in my book is metadata. But if I could understand a process, then I could say what technology is using it, what roles are performing activities, what risks, et cetera. So now I could link all those KPIs and measures for the processes and for the initiative or transformation program. Now I could get very precise on who needs to do what. And I think that's the antidote to the drift. I think the drift is, you're right, politics is just human psychology. And I always joke with people, I'm going to write a book on how to eliminate politics. I'm like, I'm just kidding. There's no answer. So that's just a given, right?
Yeah.
But how do you mitigate that is by driving a lot more discrete accountability.
Right. So there's a greater degree of ownership at each level as well as overall.
That's right.
I love that. It's a fairly simple point for people to take away from this one. So having gone through some of those early stages and your experiences of it, at what point did you sort of realize that the process rather than the technology had to be the core backbone of your method?
Because there's so much that goes into running an organization. If you think about like all the data elements, and in an organization, you have a lot of repositories that have this information. You have a system repository, you have a risk and control repository, you have third-party vendor catalogs, all of this data, but nothing connects, and it's all siloed. And if you need to investigate a problem, then you need to spend weeks or months to pull all this data together to understand it in context of what you're trying to solve. So, and that's really comes down to that common language, or as I've been using, really the common data semantic structure of what is that common thread that pulls all of this together. And ultimately, it's the context of what you do as a business to operate, to serve your customers, to make money, to manage your money, et cetera. So if you could, and I've thought about this a lot, and there is no other candidate that I think is viable. And I think the process management community has failed a lot of people, because if you ask 10 process experts how you should do this, you'd get 15 different answers. Everyone is looking for the easy button. And I firmly believe that's true. And that's why like RPA got so big, and now process mining and obviously AI. People are like, I just want to click a button and everything magically works. But I think the perspective I'm coming from is you need to do the work to understand what each team or organizational unit is doing at each level. And even if there's repeating processes or things just don't make sense, put it on the page, because then you could step back and analyze and say, why are we doing this thing? Does that make sense? Does this have any strategic value? If it doesn't, stop doing it. Or if there's opportunities where different organizational units are doing the same thing, well, maybe we should rationalize that or standardize it or put it in a shared service or outsource it. But we can't make those decisions unless we have a detailed understanding of what work is occurring. And
there's one scenario I can think of where this would be incredibly valuable to do almost as a matter of course, and that is after you've had either a major merger or an acquisition of places where you have those kinds of overlaps of responsibilities, accountabilities, and workflows, because you would expect, therefore, to find duplication in there and in theory be able to pull out savings quite easily if you had that universal map of how the work of the organization is done. Yeah,
I actually did that project for a merger of regional banks within the U.S. And it was kind of billed as a merger of equals. But yeah, what's the processes on this side? What's the processes on that side? And then have leadership or make decisions on what technology platforms or what people, what locations are we going to focus on, and then build that new process inventory where you could start to rationalize, okay, here's how the people come together. Here's where, technology gets integrated, whatever it is. But you get that laid out very cleanly. And then now you could do your requirements, do everything within the SDLC according to this map.
Yeah, and that's interesting because the map, therefore, puts the processes as the primary currency, if you like, of the way that the organization runs. Mm-hmm. And I think most people would normally put the processes sort of bottom of the list. The other two candidates I can think of is, number one, the technology. For engineers and technologists, that would probably be the primary thing in their, it's the biggest thing in their sites. They look at that.
Yeah.
And then for most other parts of an organization, whether you're looking at HR, whether you're looking at operations, the COO, most of those parts of the organization, the CIO even, would look at people as the key part to look at first normally. So how do you sort of counter that perspective that we need to think about the people first and then the processes are somewhere further down the list?
I think processes are the enabler. So I wouldn't disagree. The people first, of course. Like that's, people have to have passion for what they do. They have to feel like when they leave the day that they've accomplished something to give it their all the next day. But just process is the thing, is the glue that brings everything together. And with technology, as I'm like RPAs, I love to pick on that. When RPA hit the scene, a lot of technology organizations like, we're going to stand up a RPA Center of Excellence.
And so just for those people who've heard RPA, but not sort of robotic process automation. So it's basically the automation of processes to run in a very predictable, very unified way.
Yeah, it's good for repeatable tasks that you could just have a robot do, or a high volume. There's a bunch of criteria for it. But these technology centers of excellence, RPA centers of excellence, are really just hammers running around looking for nails. And since they were technologists, they didn't know what the business was doing. So they couldn't have a conversation of, here's how I could apply this new technology to a problem you have. So they ended up like, automating things that were in their world or things that were really unimportant. And I think that's just a great case study of having that connection to what processes you actually do, so that a technologist can now have a conversation with a business leader and lay it out and say, which of these processes are most impactful for you? And then once you have that process, now I could do some investigation of what is the current state, what does my solution look like, and how does it solve the problem?
Yeah, and I can see that once you've got the full map, it's probably very often very clear, because I think, as you pointed out, it's something that almost everybody can look at and go, I get it. I can understand my whole organization now.
Yep.
And it's a bit like the first time you put a modern cartographic map in front of somebody, they can quickly figure out what it is, even if they've never read a map before. It's that logical.
Yeah.
But there must be some pushback that you get when executives get that reaction of, do we really need to map out the entire thing before we can take the first steps?
Yeah, all the time. Because I think people are looking for that easy button.
So how do you overcome that then as a sort of an automatic sort of pushback?
So I think in general, I tell people that want to do this, start small, start in one business unit, start with your why. And I know we haven't talked about that much, but if you're going to do an initiative like this, like be very clear. What is the organization trying to accomplish? And how is what you're doing going to enable that? But start small with one business case, understand what problem a specific organizational unit is doing, and get some wins on the board, and then sell it internally within the organization. The one thing that I tell people too is when they hear me discuss this, they think, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to create process maps, like process diagrams for everything we do. And I absolutely tell people what I care about more is the process name more than the process maps. Although I do think they're important if you need to know that level of detail. But once I have that process name, then I could give it a process owner, I could give it a definition, I could do all the data alignment. And then now I could put it in front of leadership and say, what things do we need to solve in this environment? And that is just getting the name and not the model is a relatively quick exercise. And in fact, in the age of AI, if I walked into your organization, I would say, first off, give me all the documents, assuming I had authority to do this. Give me all your SOPs, your org charts, any document that describe what your organization does, run it through AI, and I could get a pretty decent draft.
Right. Okay. So that's sort of looking at an intranet or some sort of common document repo to be able to pull all that stuff in, for example. Yeah.
Well, I think there's reference models that you could absolutely use, but I think that every organization is unique. Even if you take, a retail banking organization, one bank and another bank, they all have their idiosyncrasies and their things that maybe just don't make sense. And ownership and all the resources are specific. So you do have to do some of that work. But then once I have that draft, I just go to people and say, is this right? What am I missing? What did I get wrong? Help me change it. And then I have people give me a formal attestation saying this is accurate and complete. And I do that all through the levels of this. And then now if we're making decisions based on it, someone's like, it's not right. I'm like, well, that's the person who signed off on this that's telling me this is accurate. Like, let's go back to them. Why did they tell me this?
Cool. And I presume you probably find discrepancies quite a lot then through that in the early stages of figuring these things out.
Oh, sure. And it takes some time to iterate on it because, the first draft will look different than because once you create it, you have to maintain this because organizations change all the time. But that will eventually get refined more and more as people like see this, understand the exercise deeper, think about how how what they do gets represented in this. And as you start to think about what are the efficiencies and overlaps and redundancies that we do, and how can we streamline this organization to get rid of those?
Cool. Yeah, and I think that's one of those key things, isn't it? Is getting to the point where you can start making the efficiencies. So one of the things, what I'd love to do in a moment is just start going through more sequentially, the step by step that you go through. But just before we do that, just to give us an idea, a bit of a flavor, can you tell us a story of one of these organizations that really embraced this approach and the pivot point, the change point to which they suddenly went, aha, this is the value?
Yeah. I worked at one organization. It was a kind of a financial service utility organization, but they had a business architecture team, which I don't use that term because the whole tie to business capabilities, but they had a majority of their core transactions were going through a COBOL system, right? With mainframe, they've determined at the time that they had resiliency risk from a key person dependency perspective. Like they're not a lot of COBOL programmers are saying like, I want to do this, right? So we created a process inventory across the entire organization, very 3 levels deep, not super deep, and then we took one unit that used a lot of this COBOL program code, and we detailed out what are the processes, and we actually went down deeper into a certain some of the processes, and we mapped out the process and how it used these programs, and they really loved it, and they kind of embrace us and built this after we left. Our role was just to stand it up and coach them how to do it. But from there, once they had all the internal workings of the COBOL mapped out, now you understand the interfaces, the business logic, everything that goes into the data exchanges, et cetera. And they started designing microservices that could replicate some of these things. So something like that without this structured approach, I think would be very, very difficult to do.
Very risky, I imagine, trying to do it without that sort of complete and holistic view of it.
Yeah, because the big thing is if you're going to turn on, say, these distributed microservices, is what did I miss? And the first time I turn it on, people are going to not get some of their transaction processed. And for this organization, that would have made a lot of people unhappy.
I can imagine. And one of the things I've often found with those kinds of transformations in the past is it's the side effects. That where if you're going through with a very casual lens as you go through the processes, you kind of discount the side effects because they're side effects. Yeah. And then what I've discovered later on, quite painfully, was that some of those side effects are fairly critical. Yeah. And that there's other parts of the organization that depend massively on those side effects happening.
Yep. You don't know, like every process, processes are connected to each other. I do this and I hand it off to someone else in another organization, they hand it off. But unless you understand those kind of second order impacts, then, and that's where a lot of the surprises in going through a transformation come up, because you didn't scope it, you didn't estimate it, you didn't think about it. And then when it occurs to you later in the phases of your SDLC, you're like, oh, I got to back up and inject a whole bunch of effort and cost that I didn't anticipate.
Yeah, rethink something. So this regional bank you were talking about then, I presume that they had a relatively smooth migration off that mainframe in the end, or is that still ongoing now?
No, it's done. It's they're set up. This happened, I was working on that project actually as a kickoff of COVID.
Right, okay.
So 2020. So yeah, we were in just for the first part of the process design work, and then they use this map of everything we created as their requirements design. As far as, and I wasn't associated as deeply, but yeah, it went much smoother than it would have otherwise.
Awesome. What I'd love to do then, having gone through sort of the background, how you got to it, now sort of switch gears a bit and look at sort of not a specific case, but a generic kind of approach that you take, that you sort of clarify in your book, and go through and try and cover the stages that would encompass a playbook that we can hopefully try and distill towards the end of this. So where do you start? What's the first step? You first walked into the door of a financial organization. What's the very first thing you look at?
First is, why are you doing it? Because I've done this for transformation projects. I've done it for risk and compliance. I've done it for process design automation. It's important to get clarity on why you're doing it what metrics you hope to impact, who are your stakeholders, what are they looking for? Like I really like to do some exploration of that because it has downstream effects of what models you create, what data you need, who are you integrated with, how is this all these assets and map going to be used. Then I'll do a little bit of kind of design work around, okay, here's our standards that we're going to follow. Here's the playbook for how we're going to do it, et cetera. But once all that's settled,
what does that bit look like then? So it's sort of the after you've got the why, you're sort of going into creating some sort of what is sort of the first bit that you look at and go, okay, there's something tangible we can point to.
So the second bit is ultimately what I'm doing is I'm creating a model of an organization, and I talk a lot about process inventory, and that's in the title of my book. But that's just one perspective. Process inventory is just looking at each organizational unit and detailing out what they do. But there's other model types like your value stream, which is your end-to-end perspective from concept through delivering value. There's customer journeys, which are an outside-in view of what the customer does. There's business capability models, which, I think I discounted earlier. It's still important as a thesaurus to the process inventory dictionary. I want to know where there's like processes in different organizational units. Anyways, there's all these different model types. So you have to understand what are in scope, what's in scope, and then the standards for how you're going to construct it and really define what quality looks like. And do a little bit of operating model. Like if I'm doing it as a consultant, I'll know the operating model, what roles I need to bring in. But if I'm co-creating it with them, making sure they're clear in roles and responsibilities within the team. Who's going to do the modeling? Who's going to do the creating the standards? Who's going to do the quality controls? Who's going to do all the technology work? Because you ultimately put this in a platform like a Signavio or an Eris or some other process intelligence tool where you can manage this as an asset. So I get all that settled, and the metadata. So what are the sources of metadata? So where's the system repository, the systems, where's the risks, if that's in scope, where's the roles, the organization, like where's all that data live in the organization? So I'm using the source of truth.
Right, all that sort of common understanding.
Exactly. And then what I do is once we identify an organization scope, we just start from the top and say, go to a leader of an organization unit and say, describe for me what your organization does. And they'll say, I do this, and Joe does it, and this, and Jane does it, and I do this, and Bob runs it, whatever it is. Go to that next level and repeat the same thing. What is it you do? And I keep walking down that tree, building a taxonomy of categories and processes that exist, and then I come back up. But each conversation, I typically say I do two, let's say, hour-long conversations, and depending on the org, it may not even take that long. Before I do that interview, I take everything you have and I do my homework and I create a draft because I never want to walk into a meeting with a blank sheet of paper and say,
nothing more intimidating than the blank sheet of paper interview, is there?
Yeah. So I put it in front of them and say, I guarantee this isn't right. I took my best stab. Now tell me where I need to correct it. So I'll do that interview, and then I'll come back, or I'll take that away, apply some standards and clean it up, but I'll do some metadata alignment. So I'll say, I'll attach what systems, like all the data that aligns to it, come back and do another review with them. And then at the end of that meeting, I'll say, if you're good with this, I'd like to send you an email where you could respond back that, yes, this is accurate and complete. But I do the interviews down, and then I do the attestations coming up. So everyone's on record that this is a high quality, complete, accurate work product.
Got it. Okay. And that's a fairly big piece of the work because that's essentially the discovery phase there, right?
The discovery.
Yeah.
But again, I'm just getting process names. I'm not doing any process models at this point. Teams can come back later and detail out each of these processes, what models. And then the last thing is the use case for how it's used. So if it's a transformation, I believe that organizations need to update their SDLC or their methodology to use it. So if I have a project and I could scope by what processes are in scope, now I have that traceability to everything. I could take each process and do a requirements document. I could do designs, I could do testing, I could do the people change management, all the job aids, the trainings, the procedures, all of that, so that now everything is connected as I change the environment.
And is there an element therefore of sort of working out, okay, well, these ones take, a greater degree of importance than others, and sort of trying to not quite stack rank them, but certainly get them in an order in terms of what's got a higher priority.
Oh, sure. I mean, and that comes back to the why. If you're doing a transformation, let's say you're merging, two massive banks that have a lot of business lines like retail banking, wealth, credit cards, mortgage, whatever. But if they're just merging, say, a small retail bank, well, I'm not going to do mortgage. I'm not going to do credit card. I'm not going to do wealth. Like I'm just going to inventory what's impactful for that specific transformation.
Got it.
So that's where the priorities come in there's maybe some areas of a business I would never do. Maybe I'm just going to use this as an example, but janitorial services. Like, do I need this? I don't know. The floors are clean every day. I'm good.
Right. So there is a sort of a boundary in terms of a logical area beyond which there's just no point mapping out certain things there.
Exactly. Now, and I already alluded to it, but I think a lot of organizations are struggling with AI. Of how do I use this concept of AI and large language models and use it to optimize how my organization transforms and operates? And I think the biggest challenge that I've come to is how do you customize LLMs with your proprietary operational data? And people say, oh, I've got data everywhere, right? But it's unstructured and it doesn't make sense and it's indexed to different things. So you could take all that data, you could dump it into an LLM, but if it doesn't make coherent sense as a whole, then you're not going to get any value.
If a human can't make sense of it, we can't really reasonably expect an LLM to be able to make much sense of it either.
Exactly, because and it comes to a common language. A business may call it, say, wire transfer, but a technology person may call it move money. What they're actually talking about is the same thing. But if you look at if it's called different things in different documents, how is LLM going to sort that out? So I think that's the next wave is if you could take all this data in a structured way, vectorize it, and then you could use AI, really digital twin of an organization to get massive productivity gains.
Cool. Okay, and in terms of that, then, in order to be able to do that, you've got to know exactly what it is you want as the outcome, as a result. So you're sort of defining the result fairly clearly as well in terms of the outcome. And obviously going back to the why, but you also mentioned there those metrics as well, which are essentially the definition of the program, is it not?
Yeah, like if you're doing a mortgage program, like what are the metrics that matter? There's volume, there's quality, there's accuracy in underwriting decisions, whatever it is. Being clear on what that is and tracing it all the way through all the ownership levels. And then when you're designing, say, a new technology implementation within that space, or you're outsourcing or whatever it is, using that baseline data to say, what do I want to improve? And then AI can help with all the impacts in terms of how you transform or transition to that new state.
And then the stage where you go through, because what I find is when I'm going through any kind of transformation, doing any work with people on, sort of getting their processes to a more mature state from a less mature state, what I often find is that organizations have a tendency to take what they're doing and just do it more, better, faster, quicker. And what I find is that often that scales the chaos as quickly as it scales, the valuable bits of the processes. So how do you sort of triage between the bits that is, just messy and the bits that is actually the value in there that we want to distill?
When I do this, I just capture current state as it is. I mean, there's some cases where you could just do future state, but I think it's important. I want to understand everything as it is today, because when people take a step back and look at that map and say, why do we have 50 people doing this thing over there? Like, that just doesn't make sense. Or why are we doing this over here, but we're doing the same thing over here? Like, but we're doing it differently and different technology, et cetera. So I think having that information, taking a step back, will give you a lot of insights that'll help you optimize the environment. So, and you bring up a good point. A lot of automation, a lot of process improvements, they improve the efficiency of something that doesn't make sense in the first place. And this gives you the ability to say, look, before we do this, let's take a top-down view and make sure that our operating model is optimized for what we're trying to achieve. And then we can apply automation. Yeah,
I know. Going back to Musk, I mean, you mentioned him earlier on. I think one of the things that he's been spoken about a lot for the last few years is this statement that the very first thing you want to do with any process is to delete it if you can, because then you only want to optimize the things that are actually worth keeping. So the very best thing you can do is to remove it altogether. But then if you find something you definitely need to do, there's value in there, then you optimize it. almost as the last stage. And of course, that comes down as well to how do we make sure that we've got the tech that's going to be running and doing these things so it actually lines up.
Well, there's a big connection between process and technology, and it gets into modeling too, but there's a whole space in enterprise architecture, which is defining what our technology does, creating models of it, aligning it to what the business does, et cetera. And I gave a whole webinar on that I think the enterprise architecture community is really in a disservice because they view the center of the world as business capabilities. So if you don't know business capability model, it's a abstract concept of what is it our business does. But things like, we do payments. Well, you could have, when I was at Citi, for instance, there'd be an account management capability. But at Citi, you can open a credit card account, you can open a mortgage account, I could open a retail account, I could open a wealth account. And they're like, we need to improve account opening. I'm like, which one? Because they're all different. The processes are different, the procedures are different, the technology is different. Sure, there's some the risks are different. Yeah. Everything's different. So you have to get to a level of specificity. And I've read some articles and I've talked to some friends. They're like, enterprise architects should not report to the CIO or CTO. They should report to the CEO because they should be they should be architecting the enterprise and everything that goes into it. I'm like, yeah, but if you don't have a view of what the business does at a strategic level, then you bring nothing to the table in those strategic decision making discussions. So you're not gonna do it. But anyway, so there's a tie between it. But if you think about, like, I create a process model, like one of the lowest steps in the process is an activity that says do something. Well, that's going to help trigger a whole sequence of events in technology. So it'll hit system A, which goes to system B, which goes to system C, and it comes back, and there's a whole data exchange in there. But if you could map out that my process flow connected with my system flow, now I could have a map of what the business does at a top level. I could drill down to those lower level processes and activities. And then now I could trace it to the flow in technology. And I can map out the interfaces, the business logic, the data flows, really everything. But having that map of how technology supports your processes really enables application rationalization and portfolio management and really everything that a technology organization has to manage.
Yeah, which a lot of it, when you're managing it at that level, really does come down to managing the risks and the exposure of any part of it, right?
Yeah.
Cool. So what we've spoken about up until now is, so it's quite a lot of steps. So basically it's all definition so far, right? So that's a big piece of it, is getting the definition, the understanding, the common language, everything correct. Am I understanding that right?
I think that's right. Yeah. But then you got to make it real. You got to operationalize this. So there's two parts of it. One is you got to be clear on how you're going to use this. And that means you got to change some internal processes. Like, how do you define strategy? And that's a good one, because a lot of organizations, their strategic decision makers don't really have an understanding of what's going on the ground. And if you think about the SWOT model, where are our strengths and weaknesses internally, and then externally, where's our opportunities and threats? And they have to make decision on, here's our strategy, here's a bunch of things we need to do, and we need to invest funds and people to those things, which is your initiatives. But if they don't really have that detailed data or understanding of how things are at, you're going to have a misapplication of those funds and those resources. And then, but that means you've got to think through, what is my strategy process today, and what should it look like armed with this new map and all this data of how the organization actually works, so that I could be more effective in defining strategy. Same thing with your SDLC and change. Same thing for how you drive operational excellence. And that could be a lot of goals, like getting rid of waste and inefficiencies, improving quality, improving people, and making sure people are clear on their roles and responsibilities, et cetera. Risk management. So I'm big on that because I work with banks, and I think a lot of them struggle with it, is they struggle with the regulators because there's a whole bunch of laws and regs and rules out there, but they can't map it to what people do on the ground. And when a regulator comes in and says, prove to me your control environment's good, well, they don't have anything to give them.
there isn't a direct correlation between the regulation and how they implement it and the actual sort of, I guess, the data that's spat out off the back of those processes that says, yes, we did it, we did it correctly, and we can say who did it and when they did it.
Yeah. Well, there's a direct mapping. So there's a law regulation, and then the organization needs to interpret what that means to them, which is a regulatory obligation. But I could take that regulatory obligation and place it on different processes in my map and say, these apply here. And then my risk and compliance teams can say, okay, now here's what that means. Here's the risk statement, and then here's the control I need to put in. And that's either a people-based control, or it's a system-based control, or some combination. But then once you have that traceability, now you could create reports that you could give to a regulator, that you could give to senior leadership that says, here's our mapping of all these regulations, and here's how we're doing against those. Yeah, so you need to change how you operate these different aspects of your business to take advantage of it. And then the next point is organizations change all the time. People move in and out of jobs. You do projects. You do, the one constant in business is change. Constant,
the goalposts are always moving.
The goalposts are always moving. So you're going to have a team that's dedicated to care and feeding for this data. And that means that as there's an org change, you go out and talk to them and say, okay, what does this change, and get re-attestations, or you do periodic attestations where you go back out to the business on 3-6 months, whatever you define as your policy, to refresh this information.
Got it. So that's basically maintenance and continuing to evolve the map that you've got, but then also the change program to make sure that it keeps up with reality.
Exactly. Yep. It's always got to stay accurate and complete to the extent you can.
Which, as we know, is one of the hardest things often.
Yeah. And that's the, I mentioned everyone's looking for an easy button. I'm not selling an easy button, but I think it's the right answer. And I've proven it in a number of different scenarios.
And at the end of the day, it maps very neatly onto a lot of the, I guess, traditional change maturity models, where they often basically say at the very end of it, the highest level of maturity is if you've got a deliberate maintenance and change process to your change process itself, such that it is, I guess, self-managing and self-evolving. And the very last stage of that fits neatly onto that sort of highest level of maturity. So I think from that perspective, it sort of, it ticks all the boxes that it should do, right? So it would be surprised if it didn't work with that level of detail in it.
Yeah, and you got to think about a new change process. Obviously, the core goal is to deploy new technology or deploy software that supports some function. But another thing that should come out of that is an updated process inventory with the revised information. We rolled this into production, and this is what it looks like. And if you bake that into that process, it's not really, you're not adding any new task. You are adding new tasks, but you're not adding a lot of new effort to that change process.
Awesome. That's probably a really good point then for me to try and distill all of that down into a few points that we can call a playbook, and hopefully some of our listeners can take that away with them and use it. So stage one then, I think with you and I have this in common with many others as well. Start off, Simon Sinek, I think, is probably one of the biggest proponents of this with his golden circle, but start off by clarifying the why.
Yeah.
Step one. Step two, I had that down as sort of creating a common language, the way that people communicate and understand all the same parts of the business, the organization, the processes within that. Third is the process inventory itself, building that up, going those layers deep and coming back up and getting the attestations, as you said. Number four was prioritizing it, working out which ones are more important than the others, which ones take priority. And then lastly but the next stage was tying that almost back to the why, was linking all those processes back to the strategy itself. Then we get to defining the program. What's the change itself going to look like? Now, this is where I think you need to help me a little bit. So as a next one, it's sort of really about, again, it's about that prioritization, but it's so putting the operational excellence first was how I'd describe it. And that's sort of summarizing your sort of process first, AI second, get the process working well before you try and run automations or clever bits on top of that.
Yeah. So it's just looking at, and I think it starts with people and accountability, but if you could drive that accountability, then you could have everyone become an owner within your organization and say, what am I doing? What's not working? What power do I have to change it? And let me change it. If not, if it's, maybe it's in the bowels of technology or something, but let me at least escalate that so that it could be up for the next funding round to potentially get solved. But it's driving better operational excellence through clear accountability.
Brilliant. Cool. Thank you. And then we're down to number 8. And this is the point at which we sort of finally got everything defined. And this is aligning the processes that you've got, the process map, to the technology that you've got in place and also the risks that you have throughout the organization and the industry that it's in. And that is the sort of point at which you've got sort of the baseline definition. So 8 steps of a 10-point playbook is, what is it? And then I've got 2 steps for actually executing on it. So number 9 was implement and run the framework and govern the framework, if you like, which is basically running the change itself. And then that last stage we just spoke about, which is how do you evolve and then sustain that change so that it becomes a self-running process at the end of it as step 10. So,
and I mentioned, you need people, but I think it really, probably the more important thing is commitment by everyone in every level of the organization, from top leadership all the way through, that we've got to maintain this and we've got to make sure that it's accurate and be stewards of that.
Because I think what it does is it leaves you with a powerful artifact, but also we're sort of representing cultural change here as well, aren't we? In terms of the way we do things, we now feed this back into this overall map of the value driving part of the business as well as the operational parts of the business. And that all should connect, as we said right at the beginning, back up to, so why are we here?
Why are we here? Why am I doing this? And a lot of organizations you have, at least I've run across a scenario a lot where there's that one person that knows everything, and you hope that person, doesn't get hit by a bus or plays the lotto or lottery. And what this does is it makes all that knowledge distributed, because if you give access to everyone this information, now you leverage your people as an engine of innovation, because everyone can have full knowledge and be able to make the world better.
And in theory, what it should do is it should reduce the sort of decision overhead that every single person has, because it's all connected. The connection of what I do and what I change back up to why we're here should be a lot clearer than it was without this, I feel.
Exactly. Yeah. I don't know how you get that connection otherwise besides the hero method. Like, you've got to have heroes in the organization that know how things connect, but that gives you a lot of people risk.
And I think what this does is it brings a system to it, which I think is often lacking. And I love systems because they're repeatable and they're predictable. It's been fantastic to go through this with you, Michael. But just before we wrap up, where can listeners reach you and how can they find out more about the book?
So the book's on Amazon, so Digital Transformation Success, or you could search it by my name. The second is I'm on LinkedIn. I post all the time. So go out there, connect with me, reach out if you found this fascinating. I'm always up for a conversation. And then the third way is I do have a website with my business. It's processinventory.com. And I list out some of the consulting services and my perspective in there. And then, coming soon, and I'll have a refreshed website, but my digital twin and organization platform that I'm building. That's probably Q1 of next.
We'll make sure we got links to those in the show notes for those people who are following along. And then one thing I love asking all of my guests on the CTO Playbook is if there is, one tip you would give to a CTO who's recently come into the industry, recently come up to this level of strategic leadership, what would that tip be and why?
I think being a CTO is such a complicated role. There's and I don't have to tell you that, but I think it's roll up your sleeves and really get a detailed understanding of what world you've just taken on, so that, and have intimate knowledge of all the problems and the challenges and the opportunities so that you could be effective in your role.
Thank you, Michael. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the CTO Playbook today.
It's been my pleasure, Adam. Thank you for hosting me on this.
Thank you for listening to the whole episode. I appreciate your time. So just before you go, I'd like to ask you for a favor in return for putting together this episode of the CTO Playbook for you. Please share the episode with just one person who will appreciate it. Wherever you're listening, whether that is Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or another platform, sharing the episode will help more CTOs find the podcast and enable me to create more great content. Remember that you can find more information on the CTOplaybook.com. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode of the CTO Playbook.